In the spring of 2024, beneath the soft white lights of the Imperial War Museum, a crowd stood motionless before a single canvas, a painting the size of a soldier's blanket, the colors muted and cracked with age. At first glance, it was nothing extraordinary. A man sitting alone in a barrack, his face half lit by a candle stub, snow drifting through the gaps in the wooden walls behind him. But then, as the camera drew closer, something shifted. The faint outline of barbed wire hidden in the brushstrokes, the ghost of a guard tower reflected in the man's eyes, and in the bottom corner, barely visible beneath the layers of dust and varnish, a signature scratched in trembling hand. K. Muller, Stalag IX, 1944. That name meant nothing to anyone in the room, not to the curators, not to the historians, not to the veterans' families who'd gathered that morning, but to those who knew, to the few who remembered the stories whispered across decades of silence. The initials were a miracle, the mark of a prisoner who had painted what no camera was ever allowed to see. Life inside a Nazi camp, rendered not by an outsider, but by one of the men trapped within. The brushstrokes told what official records never did. The hunger, the small rebellions, the stolen moments of beauty that existed even in hell. And as the crowd leaned closer, the gallery air heavy with reverence, someone noticed the faintest shape beneath the top layer of paint. A second figure, hidden for 80 years, revealed only by the glare of the spotlight. That was how the mystery began. How a forgotten artwork, painted on scavenged linen and smuggled through barbed wire, reopened one of the most human, most haunting stories of World War II, the story of the POW artist of Stalag IX, the man who risked everything to remind the world that even behind walls of cruelty, the soul still painted, still dreamed, still lived. The first snow of December 1944 fell over Stalag IX like a shroud, soft, silent, and cruelly beautiful. Beyond the frost-laced barbed wire, the forest of Thuringia stood skeletal and black against a pewter sky. The pines so tall and still they seemed to be listening. Inside the camp, everything was gray. The barracks, the mud, the faces of men who had long since stopped counting the days. The air smelled of smoke and boiled turnips, the stench of the latrine pits mixing with the bitter tang of coal dust that never quite burned away. At dawn, the guards' boots struck the frozen ground with metronomic precision, a rhythm that dictated every waking second of every prisoner's life. It was here, amid this machinery of despair, that Karl Müller, a 31-year-old corporal of the Wehrmacht's defeated Western Front, found himself not as a soldier but as a captive, labeled a defector by his own command and a traitor by the regime he'd once served. His barrack was Block 7, a long wooden coffin of a building with 40 men inside, each reduced to a shadow of who he'd been. The windows were sealed with cardboard. The stove burned weakly on stolen scraps of wood. At night, when the wind howled through the gaps, the men huddled together under lice-infested blankets, whispering in a dozen different tongues: English, Polish, Russian, Italian, French, the fractured symphony of Europe in captivity. Müller was different from most. He had been a painter before the war, a student of the Kunstakademie Düsseldorf, once full of bright ambition and color. He had painted riverboats, orchards, the laughter of children in sunlight. Then came the draft, the front, the betrayal of everything he thought his country was. He had seen enough blood to drain all pigment from his mind, and by the time he arrived at Stalag IX, he carried only two possessions: a dented mess tin and a pencil stub hidden in his boot heel. That pencil became his weapon, his only act of rebellion. At first he drew on scraps of paper scavenged from cigarette boxes, sketches of hands, eyes, faces in profile. Then one night he drew the guard tower, the dark silhouette rising against the snow, and beneath it the outline of a man sitting with his head bowed. It was a dangerous thing to do. Possession of contraband drawings could mean solitary confinement, even execution. But Müller couldn't stop. The more he drew, the more the camp came alive under his hand. Every line was a heartbeat, every shadow a memory. He began sketching his fellow prisoners: a Scottish sergeant named McIntyre with eyes like ice, a Polish violinist who played silently with invisible strings, a French medic named André who whispered poetry in the dark. Their faces became his gallery, their suffering his palette. Outside, the war raged on. Rumors drifted through the barbed wire like smoke. The Allies were advancing, the Russians were closing in. Berlin was burning. But inside Stalag IX, time stood still. The prisoners lived from ration to ration, from roll call to roll call, their world confined to the boundaries of wire and snow. The guards were young and frightened, many barely out of training, boys in gray who shouted to mask their own fear. One of them, Unteroffizier Becker, noticed Miller's sketches one morning when the artist was etching a portrait into the soot on his mess tin. Instead of confiscating it, Becker said nothing. Later that night, he slipped a small square of coarse paper under Miller's bunk. No words, just a gift. A silent understanding passed between them. Even the captors were tired of the hate. That act of quiet mercy changed everything. It gave Miller courage. He began to scavenge materials. Chalk from the latrine walls, pigment from rust, a brush made from horsehair bound to a stick. He mixed colors with water from melted snow and painted on anything flat enough to hold an image. Burlap, bedboards, even the lining of his coat. The first full image he completed was of the camp latrine, not as a place of filth but as a human moment. Two men laughing under a gray sky, defying the misery around them. His barrack mates laughed when they saw it, then grew quiet. One of them whispered, "You make this place look alive again." As the weeks passed, word of the artist prisoner spread through the compound. Men from other blocks came at night to see his work, to stare at something that wasn't wire or mud or death. Each new piece carried a risk. The guards began to notice the gatherings and suspicion spread. One afternoon, a search team stormed Block 7. Miller's heart stopped as they tore through his bunk, scattering his makeshift pigments and torn canvases. But when Becker appeared in the doorway, his voice cut through the chaos. "Nothing here. Move on." The soldiers obeyed. Miller never forgot that. That night, Becker approached him by the fence, his breath steaming in the cold. "You paint truth," he murmured in halting words, "but be careful. Truth is dangerous." It was the closest thing to friendship either man could afford. Then came January, the coldest month anyone could remember. The food rations halved, frostbite spread, and disease crept through the camp like smoke under the door. Men died quietly in their bunks, their bodies carried out at dawn and replaced by newcomers from the front. Miller painted through it all. He painted the frost on the window frames, the candle flames that refused to die, the faces of the lost. One night, after hearing of a comrade's death, he tore a strip of linen from a prisoner's shirt and stretched it across a frame made of cratewood. Using soot, rust, and his own blood as pigment, he began what would become his most dangerous work, a painting not of war or death, but of hope. It showed a man sitting in a barrack, candlelight on his face, snow falling through the cracks, a small smile on his lips. In the corner, unseen by most, the reflection of barbed wire gleamed faintly in his eyes. It was not meant for propaganda, not for escape, but for remembrance. He wanted to leave behind proof that even in the darkest place on earth, a man had dared to make beauty. But the danger grew. One of the guards discovered a hidden sketch beneath a floorboard and reported it to the camp commandant. Oberleutnant Weiss, a man who believed that art was a disease of weakness. Miller was summoned to the office the next morning. The walls were lined with confiscated contraband, carved chess pieces, a wooden rosary, a child's drawing torn from a letter. Weiss held one of Miller's sketches in his gloved hand, studying it like something obscene. "You were an artist?" he asked. Miller nodded. Weiss smiled faintly, cruelly. "Artists make people think. Thinking is dangerous. You will destroy these." Miller said nothing. The commandant waited, then leaned closer. "Or perhaps," he said, "you can paint something for me." What he demanded was grotesque, a portrait of the Führer to hang in the officers' mess. Miller refused. He spent 3 days in the punishment block, standing in freezing water to his knees. When they dragged him out, half dead, Becker was there again. He didn't speak. He just pressed something into Miller's hand, a single piece of charcoal. The message was clear: don't stop. That night, weak and trembling, Miller returned to his barrack. The men helped him into his bunk, covered him with their own blankets. And as he lay there shivering, he stared at the ceiling and whispered, "They can break my hands, but not what they make." He waited until the others slept, then crawled to his hidden canvas and began to paint again. Every stroke hurt. Every movement was defiance. The candle burned low, and outside the guards' voices faded into the distance. In that silence, under the endless snow, he created something that no one would see for 80 years. A truth buried under color and fear, waiting for light. When the Allies finally liberated Stalag IX in April 1945, they found the camp in chaos. The guards fled, the gates open, the air thick with smoke from burning documents. Most of Muller's work was destroyed in the fires. Only one canvas remained, hidden beneath a floorboard in Block 7, wrapped in a blanket and marked with a single word in German: Erinnerung. Memory. The soldiers who discovered it thought it just another piece of POW graffiti. They rolled it up, stored it among relics, and forgot. For decades it slept in the archives, nameless, silent, gathering dust. Until, one winter morning, a conservator noticed something strange beneath the top layer of paint. A faint outline, a second figure hidden in the shadows. The restoration took months, and when the image finally emerged, it revealed something no one expected. 2 men, not one. An artist and a guard, sitting side by side in candlelight, sharing warmth as the snow fell outside. No records survived to prove who they were. But the signature, K. Muller, Stalag IX, 1944, told the rest of the story. Not just of one man, but of all who, in the face of cruelty, chose to create instead of destroy. The painting became known as the Camp of Shadows, and in its quiet, haunting beauty, the world finally saw what the war had tried to erase, the humanity that refused to die. By February 1945, the world beyond the barbed wire was collapsing, though inside Stalag IX-C, the collapse came slowly, like a structure rotting from within. The radio in the commandant's office still sputtered propaganda, full of promises that no one believed, while the prisoners whispered of Russian artillery closing in from the east and American tanks grinding toward the Rhine. Each day began the same: the clang of the bell at dawn, the cough of engines, the shouts in German that tore through the frost. But under that repetition, something was changing, something invisible, delicate, and dangerous. Karl Müller's art had become the camp's secret pulse, spreading through the barracks like a rumor of spring. His work had crossed beyond sketches now. What began as fragments of human expression, eyes, hands, faces, had become scenes, entire moments captured in the dull light of captivity. The men called them windows. To them, his paintings weren't rebellion. They were oxygen. He painted on whatever he could find: slats of wood, torn potato sacks, the back of Red Cross packaging. The materials were primitive, but his control over them was transcendent. With soot, dirt, and even his own blood mixed into makeshift pigment, Müller found ways to carve light from darkness. One piece showed a British pilot gazing through barbed wire at the morning fog, the reflection of home faint in his eyes. Another depicted an Italian cook lighting a cigarette with shaking hands while others watched, the flame burning brighter than any hope they dared speak aloud. Each painting passed hand to hand like contraband scripture, hidden beneath coats, shared during roll call, whispered over at night. For the first time, the camp began to hum with something other than fear. But art in a prison was a double-edged sword. For every prisoner who found solace, there were guards who saw danger. Oberleutnant Weiss, the commandant, had not forgotten Müller's defiance. Though Becker shielded him when he could, the officer's curiosity curdled into suspicion. He ordered surprise searches, confiscated pencils, restricted gatherings. But it was too late. The sketches had multiplied. There were hundreds now spread across the camp, copied, hidden, memorized. Men began to replicate Müller's style in secret, drawing their own lives on scraps of stolen paper. The act of creation itself became an underground movement. And though most never met him directly, they knew his symbol: a faint triangle drawn in the corner of each piece, 3 lines representing man, art, and survival. It became the quiet emblem of a rebellion no army could suppress. In Block 7, Müller worked mostly at night. His breath fogged the air as he hunched over the linen, the candle flickering, his fingers numb. Becker often brought him scraps: an old brush from the guardhouse, a stub of charcoal from the stove. Sometimes they spoke, quietly, cautiously. Becker had grown disillusioned. He'd seen his friends die on the Eastern Front, his brother buried in Stalingrad. He admitted one night by the fence that he'd once wanted to be a photographer. But the war, he said bitterly, it turned every lens toward death. Miller looked at him and whispered, "Then look this way instead." He gestured toward the barracks where the prisoners slept. "There's life here. Look harder." Something shifted between them that night, a fragile truce built not on politics, but on shared exhaustion with cruelty. As March arrived, so did chaos. The guards grew anxious, discipline frayed. Air raid sirens howled almost nightly from nearby Weimar. The ground trembled under distant explosions. The prisoners sensed the end, but the uncertainty was worse than captivity. Would liberation come, or execution before it? Amid the fear, Miller continued to paint. His latest piece was his boldest yet, a mural on the interior wall of Block 7, painted in soot and grease. It showed no soldiers, no symbols, just hands. Hundreds of hands reaching upward from shadow toward a single beam of light. The men who saw it wept. It wasn't sentimentality, it was truth. The mural gave their suffering shape, gave meaning to their endurance. But when word reached WWII, the commandant flew into rage. He ordered it destroyed and Miller punished. Becker arrived before the guards did. He burst into the barrack breathless, whispering, "They're coming. Burn it." But Miller refused. He stood before his mural, ragged and pale, his hands trembling but defiant. When WWII entered with his officers, he stopped, transfixed by what he saw. The wall glowed in the lantern light, the hands seeming to move, to reach as if alive. For a long moment, the commandant said nothing. Then, slowly, he turned and left. "Let them have their picture," he muttered. "It won't save them." The next day, half the guards deserted their posts. The war's end had found them too. Miller's art, however, had already transcended its maker. Across the camp, his sketches were being copied and traded, carried by prisoners to neighboring compounds during labor shifts. They became a kind of currency, not for food, but for morale. The Polish violinist Jerzy used one of Miller's drawings to barter for strings. A British medic traded another for quinine to save a fevered comrade. The art was worth more than rations. It was faith, transcribed in soot. Each man who touched it added his own marks, his initials, a note, a line of prayer. Soon, every barrack contained a fragment of Miller's world, and in that, the prisoners found unity that no ideology could shatter. Then came the final days. The sky over Thuringia turned red with fire as the Allies advanced. Rumors of massacres reached them. Camps burned, prisoners executed, others abandoned to starve. The men of Stalag IX prepared for the worst. Makary brought word secretly. WWII planned to destroy the camp if the Americans arrived. "No witnesses," he said, his face pale. Miller looked at him, hollow-eyed, and asked only one question. "How long?" Becker didn't answer. That night, the prisoners gathered around the mural. No one spoke. Some prayed, some cried, others simply stared, memorizing every line of light and shadow. Miller took one last piece of linen, a scrap torn from his own blanket, and painted by the dying candle's glow. He painted Becker, not as a guard, but as a man, sitting beside him in the barrack, their faces half lit by the same flame. It was not forgiveness, not exactly, but understanding. When he finished, he looked at Becker and said, "Now we are both inside." Becker nodded, eyes glistening. At dawn, the gunfire began. The distant rumble of tanks echoed through the hills, and smoke rose from the commandant's quarters. WWII had chosen destruction. Explosives were planted near the fences. The guards shouted orders, chaos erupted. But Becker turned his rifle on his own men. He fired into the air, shouting for the prisoners to run. Panic flooded the yard. Men stumbling through snow, boots crunching, bullets slicing the mist. Miller clutched the rolled canvas under his arm as he fled with the others, heart pounding. Behind him, Block 7 went up in flames. He turned once, just in time to see Becker fall, struck by gunfire from the tower. Their eyes met across the smoke. Then Becker was gone. Hours later, the camp was silent except for the groan of burning timber. When the U.S. 89th Infantry Division arrived, they found hundreds of prisoners shivering in the forest, half-starved, eyes wide with disbelief. Among them was Muller, clutching his painting. He could barely stand. An American medic offered him water, but he only whispered, "Save this." He handed the bundle to the medic and collapsed. The painting passed through countless hands over the years, catalogued, forgotten, rediscovered, but that moment, that handover in the snow, was where history quietly pivoted. Muller did not survive the weeks after liberation. Disease and exhaustion claimed him before he could ever see his homeland again. The camp was dismantled, its records burned, its story scattered. But his work lived, buried in archives, mislabeled, unrecognized. For decades, historians puzzled over the unsigned sketches that appeared across post-war Europe, all bearing the same motif, hands reaching for light. Some called it coincidence, others myth. Then came the rediscovery in 2024, the canvas with his name and the hidden image beneath. Only then did the world realize what Muller had left behind. Not just art, but a map of human endurance drawn in the darkest place imaginable. When curators removed the final layer of grime from the camp of shadows, they found in the corner the faint triangle, the same symbol prisoners had once passed from hand to hand under threat of death. 3 lines, endless meaning, man, art, survival. In that symbol, the voices of Stalag IX spoke again. And as the museum lights dimmed around the painting's unveiling, the crowd fell silent, not out of reverence but recognition. They saw themselves in those reaching hands, in that fragile beam of light, in the truth that no war could ever fully extinguish. That creation, in defiance of destruction, is the purest act of human courage. When the war ended, Germany was a graveyard of memory, a landscape of ashes and silence where stories like Miller's vanished beneath the rubble of history. Stalag IX was dismantled within months of liberation, its barracks stripped for firewood, its fences melted for scrap. The camp's name dissolved into the bureaucracy of occupation, replaced by coordinates and numbers. The painting, the one Muller had clutched through smoke and gunfire, passed quietly into the hands of an American field medic named Private First Class Samuel D. Reeves of the 89th Infantry Division. Reeves had been 21, a farm boy from Ohio who had seen too much too fast. He found Muller unconscious, wrapped around the canvas like a man shielding a newborn child. Reeves didn't know what it was, only that it mattered. He rolled it carefully, slid it into his pack, and wrote in his field journal, "A German POW's art, maybe his last breath." He didn't realize that note would become the only surviving record of Miller's existence. After the war, Reeves returned home, married, and became a history teacher. The canvas followed him, surviving attic heat, humidity, and decades of neglect. For years, it hung forgotten in a storage trunk beside medals, ration books, and photographs. Reeves rarely spoke of the war, but sometimes, when his children asked about the bundle of cloth with the faint smell of smoke, he'd pause, trace the faint letters K. Muller, and say softly, "He was one of the good ones." When Reeves passed away in 1989, the trunk was sold at a small estate auction in Dayton, Ohio. Among the bidders was a local antique dealer, Clara Johnston, who bought the contents for $25, not for profit but for curiosity. Inside, she found the rolled canvas, brittle and cracked, its colors obscured by decades of grime. She thought it was a study painting, perhaps post-war or student work, and stored it in her shop's back room. There it sat for 35 more years, beneath a stack of old maps and cigar boxes gathering dust. Meanwhile, the world forgot Stalag IX. The archives of Thuringia held only fragments, rosters with missing names, partial photographs, and bureaucratic reports that said nothing of art or defiance. The Cold War carved Europe into two, and what remained of the old campsite became farmland, its ghosts buried beneath soil and silence. It wasn't until the reunification of Germany that a few local historians began to investigate the forgotten POW camps. Among them was Dr. Anja Hoffmann, a young archivist at the University of Leipzig who specialized in wartime cultural resistance. In 2019, she discovered a mention of an artist prisoner, Miller, in a Red Cross communication log, a single line written in faint ink, dated January 1945. No first name, no record number, just reported to have produced drawings of camp life. Risk of punishment, that sentence became her obsession. For 5 years, she scoured archives across Europe, the Bundesarchiv, the Imperial War Museum, the Musée de la Résistance. She found nothing but silence and scattered echoes. Unsigned sketches, recurring motifs of hands, candles, and barbed wire. A ghost of a man everywhere and nowhere. Then in 2024, fate intervened. Clara Johnston's antique shop, struggling in the age of digital commerce, decided to clear its storage. Among the discarded items was the old trunk marked WWII. Inside, the canvas lay folded, its edges stiff, its surface nearly black with grime. Johnston considered throwing it out, but something, perhaps the faded initials, perhaps the faint outline visible in the dirt, stopped her. She called the local museum, who redirected her to a regional art conservator in Cincinnati, Dr. Evelyn Ross. When Ross unrolled the canvas for the first time, the dust fell away like snow. She froze. Even beneath the decay, the painting radiated emotion. The two figures by candlelight, their faces rendered with haunting precision. "This isn't student work," she whispered. "This is lived experience." Ross began restoration cautiously, testing pigments, softening the cracked surface with vapor and brush. Under layers of smoke and dirt, colors began to emerge, muted ochres, ghostly whites, faint glimmers of crimson. Then came the revelation. As ultraviolet light scanned the surface, a second image appeared beneath the first, an overpainting. Hidden within the layers was another figure, faint, spectral, seated beside the central man. When Ross traced the outline, she realized it wasn't random. It was deliberate. Someone had painted over it, concealed it. In the bottom corner, almost invisible to the naked eye, were letters: K. Muller, Stalag IX, 1944. The signature matched the name in Hoffman's Red Cross log. Ross contacted the Imperial War Museum. Within weeks, experts from London arrived to examine the piece. The painting was authenticated through forensic analysis. The canvas threads matched textiles used in Wehrmacht supply sacks. The pigment chemistry corresponded to compounds found in late war Europe: soot, rust, even traces of organic material likely derived from human blood. The discovery was monumental. Not only was it a work of art created inside a POW camp, but it captured, in haunting intimacy, the shared humanity of prisoner and guard. When Hoffman saw the restored image for the first time, she wept. "It's not propaganda," she said. "It's witness." The world soon took notice. News outlets called it the lost soul of Stalag IX. Art critics compared it to the sketches of Felix Nussbaum and the diaries of Eddie Hillesum. Art as survival, beauty born in despair. But beyond the headlines, a mystery remained. Who was the second man? His face, half-lit, bore no insignia, no uniform, just quiet understanding. Hoffman believed it was Becker, the young guard who had risked everything to help Miller. To confirm, she traveled to Thuringia, to the former site of the camp, now a meadow of tall grass and whispering pines. There, with local historians, she uncovered remnants of the foundations, fragments of ceramics, even bits of charred wood from the barracks. Near the spot where Block 7 had once stood, they found a corroded metal tag engraved Ufs Becker, 1919. It was enough. The world now knew both names, the prisoner who painted and the guard who chose mercy. As the painting underwent final restoration, layers of history peeled back like skin. Beneath the grime, restorers found brushstrokes too delicate for the conditions Miller lived in, proof of extraordinary control under impossible circumstances. They found symbols hidden in the folds. The faint triangle, his mark of man, art, survival. In the background, microscopic analysis revealed faint script in German, nearly erased by time. Translated, it read, "Even among enemies, the soul remembers its brother." No one could say when or how Miller had written it, whether as a message to Becker or to the future itself. But in that single sentence, the war's brutality met its counterpoint, compassion. The painting's unveiling was set for spring 2024, at the Imperial War Museum in London. Hoffman stood beside Ross as the crowd gathered. Veterans, historians, descendants of POWs, and ordinary visitors drawn by the quiet power of its story. When the cloth was lifted, the room fell silent. The figures seemed to glow in the soft gallery light. Two men, one in prisoner's rags, the other in guard's coat, seated side by side as snow drifted through the slats behind them. Between them, the candle flame trembled. Fragile, eternal. Cameras flashed, but for those few minutes, the 21st century disappeared. It was as though time itself held its breath, watching the past remember itself. In the weeks that followed, letters flooded in, from families who had lost loved ones in camps, from artists, from soldiers. One came from a 96-year-old woman in Bavaria who claimed to have known Miller's sister. Her name was Elsa Kruger, and she remembered her brother's best friend, Karl, who painted too much and spoke too softly. She sent Hoffman a faded photograph from 1939, a group of art students in Dusseldorf laughing, holding brushes. Among them, unmistakable, was Müller, young, bright-eyed, holding a palette. On its edge was the same triangle symbol. Hoffman compared the brushstrokes from the photo's surviving sketchbook. They matched perfectly. The circle was complete, but the painting's journey wasn't over. The museum staff began cataloging the work for permanent display, and while examining the canvas under raking light, a conservator noticed something peculiar, a faint indentation on the back of the linen, as if pressure had been applied from inside the frame. When they carefully separated the backing board, a small folded scrap of paper fell free. Its edges were burnt, its ink faded, but the handwriting, tight, elegant, was legible. It read, "For whoever finds this, remember, we were not just numbers." Signed simply, K.M. O'Roy. That note changed everything. It wasn't just art anymore. It was testimony. The museum installed it beside the painting, sealed behind glass. Visitors began leaving flowers, letters, even sketches of their own. The story spread beyond the art world. Veterans spoke of reconciliation, historians of redemption. In Germany, school curriculums began including Miller's story as part of the Forgotten Witnesses program, a study of artists who resisted through creation. For the first time, the legacy of Stalag IX wasn't just one of suffering, but of shared humanity. Yet even in triumph, one mystery lingered. When infrared imaging of the painting's underlayer was complete, experts discovered faint outlines of a third figure, barely visible, unfinished, erased before completion. Some speculated it represented death, or perhaps Müller himself fading from his own creation. Hoffman believed otherwise. "It was us," she said in a later interview. "The viewer." He left space for whoever would look upon it, to become part of the memory. In that interpretation, the Camp of Shadows was not just a painting, but an invitation to bear witness, to remember, to refuse indifference. Decades after his death, Karl Müller had succeeded in what every artist dreams of, not immortality, but understanding. He had taken the darkest chapter of humanity and painted light within it. His work, born in hunger and fear, had crossed generations, borders, and ideologies to remind the living that compassion is the last form of victory. In the words etched beside his rediscovered note, now displayed in quiet reverence beneath the canvas, we were not just numbers. And so the painting lives, not merely as art, but as evidence that even when the world collapses into madness, a single act of creation can hold it together. In the glow of the museum light, the candle still burns, the snow still falls, and two men, once enemies, now eternal, sit side by side, unbroken. The unveiling of the Camp of Shadows did not end the story. It ignited one. In the weeks after the painting's public debut, something began to stir across Europe and beyond. Newspapers called it the art of conscience. Television anchors described it as the canvas that healed two enemies. But to those who stood before it, veterans, descendants, historians, survivors, it was not history. It was presence. The light of the candle seemed alive, flickering with breath, while the two men, prisoner and guard, radiated a quiet intimacy that unsettled even the most stoic viewers. The museum curators watched in astonishment as visitors stayed for hours, some whispering prayers, others weeping without knowing why. Children reached out to the glass as if to touch the faces inside. For Dr. Anya Hoffman, who had spent years chasing Miller's ghost, the scene was both triumph and sorrow. "They see beauty," she said softly to Evelyn Ross, "but what they're really seeing is forgiveness." Across Germany, the rediscovery ignited fierce debate. The story of a German soldier portrayed with compassion inside a POW camp struck a raw nerve in a nation still wrestling with its past. Some critics accused the museum of romanticizing an enemy. Others praised it for confronting humanity's complexity. Newspapers filled with editorials. Can evil be capable of grace? Should we forgive the uniform? But amid the noise, survivors of other camps began writing letters, describing how they too had witnessed small acts of mercy that history had ignored. One wrote, "I remember a guard who hid bread in my coat. His name is gone, but I remember his hands." Another said, "The painting speaks for all who chose compassion when cruelty was law." In that way, Miller's art became a mirror, not of one moment but of countless unseen ones, scattered across the ruins of Europe. Meanwhile, Hoffman and Ross found themselves at the center of something larger than they could have imagined. Invitations poured in, from Paris, Warsaw, Washington, asking for traveling exhibitions, lectures, documentaries. Yet Hoffman resisted the glamour. She wanted truth, not spectacle. She returned to Germany, to Thuringia, where Stalag IX had once stood. The meadow was quiet now, wind rippling through the grass, birds nesting in the remnants of foundation stones. She brought with her the descendants of both men, Elsa Kruger's granddaughter, Lena representing Miller's bloodline, and Wilhelm Becker's grandson Thomas, a reserved man who had grown up unaware of his grandfather's past. The meeting was awkward at first, two families bound by a history neither had chosen. But as they stood together in the cold spring air, Hoffman read aloud the words from Miller's hidden note. "We were not just numbers." The silence that followed was absolute. Then Lena reached into her coat pocket and withdrew a folded print, a photograph of the painting. She handed it to Thomas. "He helped him," she said quietly. Thomas nodded, tears forming. "And he saved him," he replied. From that day, the story spread beyond museums and media, into classrooms, theaters, and hearts. Documentaries filmed the site where the camp once stood. Volunteers erected a small memorial stone engraved with Miller's words. Artists began painting tributes. Musicians composed scores inspired by the scene. Poets wrote verses of candlelight and snow. In Warsaw, a theater troupe performed a stage piece titled Erinnerung, Memory, in which the actors never spoke, only painted on stage while snow fell in silence. In Paris, a group of students projected the Camp of Shadows onto the facade of a university building, declaring it a light that refuses extinction. Across social media, millions shared the image, unaware that each repost, each click, echoed a defiance that had once been punishable by death. But the most extraordinary moment came months later, during an international symposium at the Imperial War Museum. Scholars, veterans, and descendants gathered to discuss art as witness. Hoffman presented her research, tracing the line from Miller's charcoal sketches to the rediscovered masterpiece. Then Thomas Becker took the stage. Nervous, his voice trembling, he began, "All my life I was told my grandfather was a guard. No one said he was human." He paused, glancing toward the painting projected behind him. "When I saw his face in that light, I didn't see guilt or pride. I saw a man who remembered his soul." The audience fell silent. "We talk about war as if it divides us," he continued. "But my grandfather's enemy was the man who saw him, really saw him, and painted him back into humanity." When he finished, even the veterans in the front row stood and applauded. Hoffman wiped her eyes. For the first time in decades, history had become reconciliation. Meanwhile, new discoveries began to surface. Archivists, inspired by the attention on Miller's work, reopened forgotten Red Cross files and post-war testimonies. In one box, mislabeled and sealed since 1953, Hoffman found a letter addressed to the American who carried my painting. It had never been delivered. Inside, written in shaky German, were Miller's last words, dictated from a field hospital weeks before his death. "If this reaches you, I thank you. The painting is not mine anymore. It belongs to whoever needs to believe that men can choose kindness." Signed once again, K. Mueller. Hoffman sent a copy to Reeves's surviving family in Ohio. When his grandson read it aloud at the museum, he said simply, My grandfather kept his promise. As the world revisited the story, historians began connecting other dots. Fragments of Müller's earlier work, tiny sketches smuggled from Stalag IX, began surfacing at flea markets, estate sales, and private collections. Each bore his distinct mark, the triangle of man, art, survival. One particularly haunting sketch showed a lone candle on a table, its flame bending toward a window shaped like barbed wire. Underneath, the caption in faded pencil, "Light bends, but it does not break." Experts confirmed it was his hand. The sketch was later placed beside the Camp of Shadows, where visitors now see both, the beginning and the end of the same story. Not everyone accepted the narrative without resistance. There were skeptics, revisionists who argued the painting's sentimentality distorted the brutality of the camps. One critic wrote, "Art cannot redeem atrocity. It can only aestheticize it." Hoffman responded with a single line, "It does not redeem. It remembers." That became the inscription on the museum's plaque. And still the crowds grew. Veterans returned with families, teachers brought students, survivors stood quietly before the frame and whispered to ghosts. Some swore they could smell snow, others claimed the candlelight flickered faintly when no one breathed. Perhaps imagination, perhaps something deeper, but all agreed it felt alive. Months later, the Imperial War Museum loaned the painting to Berlin for a special exhibition titled "Against Forgetting." The piece hung in a darkened room, illuminated only by a single overhead lamp. On opening night, over 2,000 people stood in silence as the curator spoke of Müller, Becker, and the anonymous hands that had preserved their story. Among the attendees was a frail man named Otto Weiss Jr., the son of the former commandant. He had lived his entire life burdened by his father's legacy. Standing before the canvas, he whispered, "He tried to destroy beauty, and yet it lived." Hoffman, standing nearby, heard him and replied gently, "Because beauty doesn't ask permission." Otto wept openly, and for the first time, the name Weiss was spoken in that hall without hatred, not to absolve but to close a wound. The painting's influence began reaching beyond memory into activism. Humanitarian organizations used Müller's story in campaigns for tolerance and reconciliation. The triangle symbol, once carved in secret on barrack walls, was adopted by youth groups across Europe as a sign of empathy and resistance to dehumanization. In schools, students painted their own versions of the Camp of Shadows, depicting modern conflicts, refugees, and acts of courage. What had begun as one man's defiance inside a prison became a universal language. Creation as rebellion against despair. By late 2024, as the world marked the 80th anniversary of the war's end, Hoffman found herself standing once more in the empty meadow of Thuringia. The grass whispered in the wind, and the sky carried the same pale hue seen in the painting's background. She placed a small lantern where Block 7 once stood, its flame trembling in the dusk. "You kept your promise, Carl," she whispered. In that moment, the quiet seemed to answer, a rustle, a shift in the air as if the earth itself remembered. She thought of Müller's final words hidden beneath the paint. Even among enemies, the soul remembers its brother. Then she thought of Becker, the guard who defied orders, and Reeves who carried the painting home, and all the nameless hands who had carried light through darkness. The chain was unbroken. As night fell, Hoffman looked up at the stars and imagined each one as a candle, billions of them, flickering across the sky, each belonging to someone who had chosen compassion when cruelty was easier. That was the true legacy of the Camp of Shadows. It was not about the past, but the decision that every generation must make to see one another, even across the lines of hate. For as long as that painting existed, humanity could never again say it hadn't been shown the way. And somewhere, deep in the archives of light and silence, 2 men, 1 prisoner, 1 guard, remained forever seated in the glow of their shared flame. Proof that in the darkest of winters, a single act of creation can outlast the empire of death. By the winter of 2025, the Camp of Shadows had traveled farther than any of its creators could have dreamed. It had crossed borders, languages, and decades, transcending war to become something elemental, a mirror for humanity itself. When the Imperial War Museum announced the painting's world tour, the first stop was not New York or Paris, but Weimar, a city only 30 miles from where Müller had died. The decision was deliberate, symbolic. For the first time, his art would return home. On a gray morning dusted with snow, a convoy of armored art transport vehicles wound through the roads of Thuringia. The canvas lay inside a climate-controlled case escorted by curators, soldiers, and silence. Outside, the landscape rolled by. Forests, skeletal in the cold, fields ghostly under frost. Hoffman sat beside the crate, watching her reflection in the glass, feeling both guardian and trespasser. She thought of Müller's frozen hands, of Becker's final breath, of the millions who never returned. And yet she also thought of the light, that flicker that refused to die even in the coldest place on earth. In Weimar, preparations had been underway for months. The city's museum, housed in a restored 18th-century palace, had converted its main gallery into a single vast chamber of shadow and silence. The curators had chosen no music, no projections, and only space, light, and truth. The painting would hang alone, centered under a skylight designed to mimic the pale sun of winter. As workers mounted it to the wall, Hoffman noticed something curious. The candle flame in the painting seemed to shimmer faintly in the natural light, as though alive. "It's breathing," whispered one of the technicians. She didn't correct him. In a way, it was. The exhibition opened quietly, without fanfare. Visitors filed in one by one, moving as though entering a chapel. Veterans in wheelchairs, students in scarves, mothers holding children, all drawn by the same gravity. In the hush, the only sound was the echo of footsteps. Before the painting, people lingered for minutes, sometimes hours. Some knelt. Others left small objects, notes, photographs, bits of ribbon, sketches of their own. It became a ritual of sorts, a secular prayer. The museum began cataloging these offerings, over 10,000 by spring. Among them was a photograph of a British airman with Stalag IX, 1945, written on the back. Hoffman examined it under magnification. The man's eyes were tired but alive, and in the background, blurred by motion, she saw the faint outline of another figure holding a brush. Müller. As the months passed, the painting's reach grew into something almost spiritual. Psychologists cited it in papers on trauma and healing. Theologians debated its theology of compassion. Artists invoked it as proof that beauty could survive horror. Yet what made it immortal was not theory but presence. Those who saw it spoke of feeling seen, not by the figures in the painting but by the human truth behind them. The candle's flame, they said, seemed to recognize each viewer personally, as if reminding them that kindness is a form of remembrance. Then one spring evening, an unexpected visitor arrived, an elderly woman named Margaret Weiss, the granddaughter of the camp's commandant. Her letter to the museum had been humble, even hesitant. "I wish to stand before what my grandfather tried to destroy." She came alone, walking slowly with a cane, her eyes sharp with age but heavy with inheritance. When she entered the gallery, Hoffman followed at a respectful distance. Margaret stopped before the canvas, her breath unsteady. "He burned their homes," she whispered. "He wanted this gone." A long pause. "And yet here it is." Tears ran down her cheeks. Hoffman stepped forward and placed a hand on her shoulder. "Because your grandfather lost to something stronger," she said softly. "To humanity." Margaret nodded. "Then maybe we all want a little too." In that moment, the ghosts of both victims and perpetrators seemed to exhale together. Later that night, after the museum had closed, Hoffman stayed behind. She sat alone in the gallery, notebook on her lap. The only light coming from the overhead skylight and the painted flame below. She opened Müller's final letter, the one Reeves had never received, and read it again, the words now etched in her mind. "The painting is not mine anymore. It belongs to whoever needs to believe that men can choose kindness." She looked up at the canvas. "They do," she whispered. "They need to. Still." Then, for the first time in months, she allowed herself to cry, not out of sorrow but gratitude. Because somehow, across 80 years and unimaginable loss, a prisoner's hand had reached forward through time and touched the living. That night, a storm rolled over Weimar. Thunder rattled the windows. Rain lashed the museum roof. The staff would later say that the lightning struck so close the lights flickered. Hoffman looked up, and in that flash the candle in the painting seemed to flare brighter than ever, before settling back into calm. She smiled through tears. Still burning, she murmured. By the following year, the Camp of Shadows had become one of the most visited artworks in modern history. Over 12 million people saw it during its tour, from Auschwitz to Tokyo, from Jerusalem to New York. Everywhere it went, it left the same silence in its wake. In Warsaw, survivors lit real candles before it. In Kyoto, monks bowed to it as to a relic of human endurance. In New York, schoolchildren traced its outline and wrote essays titled, "The Flame That Survived." Even online, where attention spans evaporated by the second, the image defied digital haste. It lingered, calm, haunting, patient. In Berlin, during its final European showing, something extraordinary happened. A young artist named Marek Feld, whose grandparents had survived Theresienstadt, projected a live image of the painting onto the Berlin Wall Memorial during the Night of Remembrance. As the crowd watched, he whispered into the microphone, "They wanted silence. We give them art." The image glowed across the concrete like a resurrection. Two men in candlelight, surrounded by darkness but unbroken. Cameras captured it, and within hours the photograph circled the globe. The next morning, newspapers declared, "The light returns to Berlin." But the most intimate moment came not in front of cameras or crowds. It came when Hoffman visited the grave of Samuel Reeves in Dayton, Ohio. She carried a small replica of the painting, a gift from the museum, and placed it beside his headstone. "You carried him out," she whispered. "Now the world carries them both." The wind stirred, rustling leaves like turning pages. Somewhere nearby, a church bell tolled, slow, solemn, alive. Hoffman closed her eyes and thought of Miller's triangle: man, art, survival. It was complete. Years later, when Hoffman herself grew old, the world had changed again. Wars still burned in other places. Cruelty still found new forms, yet the painting endured, a steady ember in the cultural memory of humankind. In schools, children learned not just names and dates, but the story of two men who chose compassion. In museums, artists spoke of Miller as a saint of creation, Becker as the silent witness, Reeves as the messenger. The world had built entire philosophies on the idea that empathy could be immortal, and at the center of it all, always, that small, trembling candle. The original painting now rests in a climate-controlled vault beneath the Imperial War Museum. It travels rarely, but when it does, it moves like a sacred object, escorted by guards not of war but of peace. Before every exhibition, curators light a single real candle before uncrating it, to remind it we're still here, they say. On one such occasion, Hoffman's successor, a young historian inspired by her work, found a faint new crack in the surface near the lower edge. When examined under microscope, it revealed not damage but faint pigment movement, as though the flame itself had subtly shifted over time. Scientists dismissed it as humidity, but others smiled quietly. Perhaps, they said, art really does breathe. And so the story lives, not on plaques or in archives, but in the air we share, in every small act of kindness that defies cruelty. Carl Miller, the artist prisoner of Stalag IX, Wilhelm Becker, the guard who chose mercy, Samuel Reeves, the soldier who carried memory home. Their lives are no longer separate threads but a single tapestry, woven through history's darkest hour into its brightest light. Their story began in captivity, but it ends in freedom, and the freedom to create, to forgive, to remember. When visitors stand before the Camp of Shadows now, they often describe the same sensation, a warmth, subtle yet real, as if standing near fire. Some call it imagination, others call it grace. Hoffman, before her passing, called it truth. "The light never died," she said in her final interview. "It just waited for us to open our eyes, and perhaps even now, in some unmarked place where the snow once fell on Stalag IX, the ground still glows faintly at night, not with ghosts but with the echo of that flame. For art, once born in defiance, does not vanish. It waits, patient, luminous, for the next hand, the next heart, to carry it forward, because in the end every war ends the same way, not with victory, but with remembrance. And in that remembrance, painted in soot and mercy, a candle still burns.